The Boat That Won the War. How a New Orleans Bootlegger's Dumb Box Conquered Two Oceans. Prologue. The Meeting That Changed Everything. New Orleans, Louisiana. Summer 1940. The air hung thick and heavy with humidity as Andrew Jackson Higgins stormed out of yet another meeting with Navy procurement officers. At 55 years old, with a face weathered by decades of Louisiana sun and a temper sharpened by endless bureaucratic rejection, Higgins had every reason to be furious. For 7 years, 7 long, frustrating years, he had been trying to sell the United States Navy on a revolutionary idea, a shallow draft landing craft that could drive straight onto a beach, drop its front ramp, discharge troops or vehicles, then back off and return for another load. The Navy officials had looked at his designs with barely concealed contempt. Too simple, they said. Structurally unsound, they claimed. The front ramp will never work, they insisted. One officer had actually laughed in his face, calling his design a dumb boat that would get Marines killed. What those Navy brass didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that they were looking at the future of warfare itself. They were dismissing the single most important tactical innovation of the coming war. They were rejecting the very weapon that would make Allied victory possible. And Andrew Higgins? He was about to prove every single one of them wrong. But this isn't just a story about a boat. This is a story about innovation versus bureaucracy, about practical experience versus theoretical expertise, about how the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history turned on something as seemingly mundane as the design of a landing craft. This is the story of how a hard-drinking, fast-talking former bootlegger from the Louisiana bayous designed the weapon that won World War II, and how the enemies of democracy fatally underestimated both the man and his creation. Chapter 1. The Bootlegger's Education. To understand how Andrew Higgins revolutionized amphibious warfare, you first have to understand where he came from, and why his background made him uniquely qualified to solve a problem that had stumped naval architects for decades. Andrew Jackson Higgins was born in Columbus, Nebraska in 1886, but he found his true calling in the swamps, bayous, and shallow waterways of Louisiana. In the 1920s, he ran a small boat-building company in New Orleans, constructing shallow draft vessels for oil companies, trappers, and anyone else who needed to navigate the maze of waterways that crisscrossed the Louisiana coast. But there was another side to Higgins' business, one that gave him an education no naval architect could match. This was the era of Prohibition, and the Louisiana coast was a smuggler's paradise. Rum runners needed fast, shallow draft boats that could navigate treacherous waters in darkness, evade Coast Guard cutters, run up onto beaches or mudflats to unload cargo, then get off quickly and disappear into the night. And Andrew Higgins built those boats. Now, historical records from this period are understandably sparse, and Higgins himself always carefully sidestepped direct questions about his Prohibition-era clients. But the facts speak for themselves. Higgins Industries built dozens of boats during the 1920s that were perfectly suited for smuggling operations. These vessels had to be fast, maneuverable, reliable, and, most crucially, capable of beaching themselves in shallow water and getting off again without getting stuck. Every time a rum runner in one of Higgins' boats successfully evaded federal agents, every time one of his designs ran up onto a beach and backed off before the authorities could respond, Higgins learned something invaluable. He learned what worked and what didn't, under real-world conditions where failure meant capture or death. He learned that most boats had too deep a draft. They got stuck on sandbars and beaches. He learned that conventional propeller designs were vulnerable in shallow water. He learned that you needed the right hull shape to run up onto a beach without getting wedged in the sand. And he learned that a protective tunnel for the propeller was essential to prevent damage when operating in barely a foot of water. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, Andrew Higgins had accumulated more practical knowledge about shallow water operations than perhaps anyone else in America. He had built hundreds of boats, learned from thousands of operations, and refined his designs through brutal trial and error in conditions where mistakes weren't forgiven. And then he looked at the United States military's approach to amphibious operations and realized they were doing everything wrong. Chapter 2. The Amphibious Problem. In the early 1930s, the United States military faced a problem that nobody had really solved. How do you land troops on a hostile beach? It sounds like a simple question, but it's anything but. When you arrive at an enemy-held coastline in ships that draw too much water to get close to shore, how do you get thousands of troops onto the beach quickly, with their equipment intact, while under enemy fire? The traditional method was both slow and deadly. Troops would climb down cargo nets from transport ships into small boats, often just standard lifeboats or motor launches. These boats would then motor toward shore until they hit shallow water, at which point troops would have to jump out and wade through chest-deep or neck-deep water to reach the beach, holding their rifles over their heads, struggling against currents and waves, presenting perfect targets for any defenders on the shore. This method was a massacre waiting to happen, and military planners knew it. The Japanese, who had been conducting amphibious operations in China throughout the 1930s, used a similar system. Their boats couldn't beach themselves. They would stop in water several feet deep, and troops would wade ashore. It worked when facing poorly equipped Chinese defenders, but Japanese planners knew it would be suicidal against well-prepared positions with modern weapons. The British had tried to solve this problem at Gallipoli in 1915, with disastrous results. Thousands of Anzac troops had waded ashore into withering Turkish fire, turning the water red with blood. The British had learned from this catastrophe and developed some specialized landing craft, but these were few in number and still had significant limitations. The United States Marine Corps, which would be expected to conduct most American amphibious operations, knew they needed a better solution. In the mid-1930s, they began experimenting with purpose-built landing craft. The Navy's Bureau of Ships started designing specialized vessels for amphibious assault. There was just one problem. The Navy's designs didn't work very well. The Bureau of Ships landing craft had a rectangular bow that could lower to become a ramp. It was a good concept, but the execution was flawed. These boats had a relatively deep draft, which meant they couldn't get very close to shore. They were slow and awkward to handle. The ramp mechanism was complex and prone to jamming. And most critically, the hull design meant that once they drove onto a beach, they often couldn't get back off. They would get stuck in the sand, sitting targets for enemy artillery. The Navy spent years refining these designs, making incremental improvements, adding complexity upon complexity, and they got nowhere. Meanwhile, down in New Orleans, Andrew Higgins was watching all this with growing frustration. He had the solution to their problem. He'd been building boats that could do everything the Navy needed for years. His boats had a shallow draft, sometimes less than 3 feet when fully loaded. They could run right up onto a beach in water just a foot deep, and most importantly, they could back off again without getting stuck, even under heavy load. In 1933, Higgins decided to offer his boats to the military. Surely, he thought, they would recognize the value of his designs. Surely they would see that he had already solved the problem they were struggling with. He could not have been more wrong. Chapter 3. 7 Years of Rejection. From 1933 to 1940, Andrew Higgins engaged in a frustrating battle with Navy bureaucracy that would have broken a lesser man. The first time he approached Navy procurement officers with his designs, they barely looked at them before dismissing him. "We have our own designers," they told him. "We don't need some civilian boat builder from Louisiana telling us how to build landing craft." But Higgins was persistent. He came back again and again, each time with refined designs, with working models, with performance specifications that blew the Navy's own craft out of the water. And each time, he was rejected. The reasons for rejection varied, but they all came down to the same basic problem. The Navy's own bureau had invested years and significant money in their own designs, and admitting that a civilian outsider had built something better would be embarrassing. This is one of the oldest stories in military procurement: institutional pride and bureaucratic inertia preventing the adoption of superior technology. Navy architects looked at Higgins' simple, elegant designs and scoffed. Where were the complex engineering systems? Where was the sophisticated machinery? Higgins' boats looked too simple, too basic. Surely something that looked like it had been cobbled together in a backyard workshop couldn't be better than the result of years of research by credentialed naval architects. They were making the same mistake that would later be made by Japanese and German analysts. They were confusing simplicity with inferiority. The truth was precisely the opposite. Higgins' boats were simple because Higgins had ruthlessly eliminated everything that wasn't necessary. Every design element had been tested under real-world conditions. Every component had been refined through actual use. The simplicity wasn't a lack of sophistication. It was the mark of true mastery. But the Navy couldn't see it, or wouldn't see it. In 1938, the Marine Corps conducted comparative tests between Navy Bureau of Ships landing craft and Higgins boats. The results weren't even close. Higgins boats could beach in half the water depth, could retract more reliably, were faster, more maneuverable, and cheaper to build. The Navy's response? They changed the testing criteria to favor their own designs and declared their boats superior. Higgins was furious, but he didn't give up. He began lobbying Marine Corps officers directly, demonstrating his boats to anyone who would watch. Some Marines were impressed and became advocates for his designs within the military. But the Navy's Bureau of Ships remained implacably opposed. By 1940, with war clouds gathering in Europe and Asia, Higgins was beginning to despair. The United States military was preparing for a war that would inevitably involve amphibious operations, and they were planning to use inferior equipment that would get Marines killed. He knew his boats were better. The Marines who had tested them knew his boats were better. But the bureaucracy wouldn't budge. And then everything changed. Chapter 4. The Demonstration that changed the war. In May 1941, with war looking increasingly inevitable, the Navy finally agreed to conduct new comparative trials between their Bureau of Ships landing craft and Higgins boats. This time, the trials would be overseen by officers from multiple branches, not just Navy brass with a vested interest in their own designs. The trials were held in Norfolk, Virginia, and they would become the stuff of legend in military procurement circles. The Navy wheeled out their latest designs, complex, expensive craft that represented years of development and millions of dollars in investment. They performed adequately, beaching in about 3 feet of water and managing to retract after some effort. Then it was Higgins' turn. Andrew Higgins, now 56 years old but still full of fire, personally piloted one of his boats for the demonstration. He drove it at full speed toward the beach, running it onto the sand in less than 2 feet of water. The front ramp dropped. An imaginary squad of Marines could have disembarked directly onto dry sand. Then, before the Navy observers had even finished taking notes, Higgins threw the boat into reverse. The protected propeller in its tunnel churned the shallow water, and the boat slid smoothly backward off the beach and into deeper water. The whole operation, from beaching to departure, took less than a minute. Then Higgins did it again, and again, and again. He beached that boat a dozen times, each time in slightly different conditions, different angles of approach, different wave states, different tidal conditions. Every single time, the boat performed flawlessly. But Higgins wasn't done. For his final demonstration, he did something that made the Navy observers' jaws drop. He deliberately ran the boat onto a beach at high speed, intentionally grounding it firmly in the sand, the kind of beaching that would strand a normal boat until the tide changed. Then he backed it off anyway. The powerful engine and the protected propeller design allowed the boat to literally pull itself backward through the sand and into the water. One Marine Corps observer was heard to say, "That's it. That's what we need. Every single one of our landing craft should be built like that." Even with this demonstration, it took until August 1941 for the Navy to finally place a significant order with Higgins Industries. The bureaucratic resistance remained strong right up until the last moment. But with war now clearly imminent, German U-boats were already attacking American ships, and Japan was preparing for its southern expansion, the military could no longer afford to let pride stand in the way of effectiveness. The first large order was for 1,000 boats. Higgins, who had been building perhaps 100 boats per year, now had to scale up production by an order of magnitude. It was an enormous challenge, but Higgins had been waiting for this opportunity for 8 years. He was ready. What no one realized yet, not Higgins, not the Navy, not the Marines, was that 1,000 boats would be nowhere near enough. Before the war was over, Higgins Industries would build more than 20,000 landing craft, and those boats would carry Allied troops onto every significant contested beach of World War II. But first, those boats would have to prove themselves in combat. And for that, we need to look at how America's enemies viewed these new weapons, and how catastrophically they underestimated them. Chapter 5. Japanese Contempt In Tokyo, Japanese naval intelligence officers received their first detailed reports about American landing craft development in early 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor. What they read made them confident, perhaps too confident, about Japan's ability to defend its newly conquered island empire. The reports noted that American landing craft were simple in design, utilizing basic construction methods. The intelligence summary described them as plywood boxes with outboard motors, a characterization that wasn't entirely inaccurate for the earliest models, but which missed the sophisticated engineering that made them effective. Japanese officers, trained in a military culture that prized complexity and sophistication, looked at photographs of Higgins boats and saw crude, desperate measures by an enemy that lacked proper landing craft. They saw boats that looked like they'd been thrown together in civilian boatyards, which, technically, they had been. What the Japanese didn't understand was that this apparent simplicity was actually a massive strategic advantage. Japanese amphibious doctrine, developed through operations in China and Southeast Asia, relied on specialized naval units using boats that could only be operated by trained naval personnel. These boats were more complex, more sophisticated by Japanese standards, and this meant Japan could only conduct amphibious operations at a limited number of locations at once, constrained by the availability of specialized units and equipment. The Higgins boat, by contrast, was designed to be operated by anyone with basic boat handling skills. The simplicity that Japanese intelligence mocked meant that American forces could train thousands of coxswains quickly, could manufacture boats in dozens of facilities across the United States, and could replace losses rapidly. Moreover, Japanese defensive planning for their Pacific Island conquests was based partly on the assumption that American forces would face the same challenges that Japanese forces had faced in their own amphibious operations: slow landing processes, troops exposed in deep water, boats that couldn't extract quickly after landing. A captured Japanese defensive plan from 1943 reveals the extent of this miscalculation. The plan, prepared for the defense of a Central Pacific island, allocated defensive positions based on the assumption that American troops would have to wade through at least 30 to 50 meters of surf zone, providing ample time for Japanese machine gunners and artillery to inflict massive casualties. This assumption was based on Japanese own landing procedures and on pre-war observations of American and British amphibious exercises. What the Japanese planners didn't account for was that the Higgins boat, with its ability to drive directly onto the beach and drop its ramp on dry sand, would eliminate most of that vulnerable approach phase. The first time Japanese defenders encountered Higgins boats in large numbers was at Guadalcanal in August 1942. The results shocked Japanese commanders. American Marines were hitting the beaches in waves, disembarking directly onto sand, not struggling through the surf zone as Japanese doctrine predicted. The boats were retracting and returning for more loads with a speed and efficiency that Japanese observers found difficult to believe. A Japanese after-action report from Guadalcanal, captured later in the war, contains a telling passage. The enemy landing craft demonstrated unexpected capabilities. They approach at high speed and discharge troops directly onto the beach, then retract quickly for additional loads. This allows the enemy to land troops at a much higher rate than our defensive plans anticipated. But even after Guadalcanal, Japanese high command didn't fully grasp what they were facing. They attributed American success to numerical superiority and aerial dominance, not to superior amphibious technology. This would prove to be a fatal error in judgment. As the island-hopping campaign progressed, Japanese defenders found themselves consistently overwhelmed by the sheer volume and speed of American amphibious assaults. The Higgins boat, that simple plywood box, was allowing the United States to conduct amphibious operations on a scale that no nation had ever achieved before. By 1944, Japanese defensive doctrine had evolved to account for American landing craft capabilities, but by then it was too late. The strategic initiative had been lost, and Japan was fighting a desperate defensive campaign across the Pacific. The dumb boats that Japanese intelligence had dismissed were now delivering American Marines and soldiers to beaches from the Aleutians to the Philippines, and there was nothing Japan could do to stop them. Chapter 6. German Miscalculation. While Japan faced the Higgins boat in the Pacific, Germany was preparing to face it in Europe. and German intelligence made similar mistakes in assessing this new American weapon. In 1942 and early 1943, as the Allies prepared for amphibious operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean, German intelligence services compiled detailed reports on Allied amphibious capabilities. These reports focused heavily on British landing craft, which had seen action at Dunkirk, Dieppe, and in various commando raids. American landing craft, the Higgins boats, received less attention initially. When they did appear in intelligence reports, German analysts made the same fundamental error as their Japanese counterparts. They confused simplicity with weakness. One German intelligence summary from 1943, captured after the war, described American landing craft as primitive designs utilizing commercial boat-building techniques, and assessed that these craft lack the robustness necessary for contested assault landings. This assessment was based partly on analysis of construction methods. German engineers, examining photographs and specifications of Higgins boats, noted that they were built using plywood, had relatively simple engines, and lacked the armored protection of some British designs. The boats looked, to German eyes, like civilian vessels hastily militarized, something that desperate Americans had thrown together because they lacked proper military industry. What German analysts failed to appreciate was that this simplicity was a massive strategic advantage. While Germany's own amphibious craft were complex and required specialized facilities to build, Higgins boats could be produced in vast numbers using standard commercial boat-building techniques. This meant America could outproduce Germany in landing craft by an almost incomprehensible margin. Moreover, German defensive planning, particularly for the Atlantic Wall, was based partly on the assumption that Allied amphibious assaults would follow conventional patterns. Troops would land from boats in relatively deep water and face a long, exposed approach to the beach, time enough for German defenders to bring devastating fire to bear. The first large-scale test of Higgins boats against German defenders came in Sicily in July 1943. The assault was massive, thousands of Allied troops landing across miles of coastline, and the primary vehicle delivering them was the Higgins LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel. German defenders were shocked by the speed and scale of the assault. One captured German officer, interrogated after the Sicily campaign, reported, "They came in waves like nothing we had prepared for. Their boats drove directly onto the beaches, dropped ramps, and troops poured out. Before we could concentrate fire on one landing area, boats were already extracting and more were arriving. We had never seen amphibious operations conducted at this pace." But even after Sicily, even after the successful Allied landings at Salerno and Anzio, German high command didn't fully grasp what they were facing. They attributed Allied success to overwhelming air and naval superiority, which was certainly a factor, but they underestimated the role of superior amphibious technology. This miscalculation would have catastrophic consequences on June 6, 1944. When the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, the assault was spearheaded by thousands of landing craft, the vast majority of which were Higgins boats. The LCVP carried troops, the larger LCM, landing craft, mechanized, also a Higgins design, carried vehicles and tanks. German defenders on the Atlantic Wall had prepared for an amphibious assault, but their defensive plans were based on incorrect assumptions about the speed and scale at which troops could be landed. They expected that heavy seas would prevent large-scale operations, that boats would have difficulty approaching the beaches, that troops would be exposed during a long approach through the surf zone. Instead, Higgins boats powered through rough seas, drove onto beaches in conditions German planners thought would prevent amphibious operations, and delivered troops directly onto sand, albeit often while under heavy fire. The simplicity that German intelligence had mocked meant that when boats were damaged or destroyed, they could be quickly replaced. When coxswains were killed, others took their place. By the end of D-Day, more than 150,000 Allied troops had been landed on the Normandy beaches, the vast majority delivered by Higgins boats. It was the largest amphibious operation in history, and it succeeded largely because Andrew Higgins had designed a boat that could perform reliably under the worst possible conditions. A post-war analysis by German military historians concluded that one of Germany's critical strategic errors was underestimating Allied amphibious capabilities. The report specifically noted that German intelligence had failed to appreciate that American landing craft, while simple in design, represented a revolutionary approach to amphibious warfare that allowed operations on a scale previously thought impossible. Too little, too late. By the time Germany understood what they were facing, Allied troops were already racing across France, delivered to Europe's shores by the boat that German intelligence had called a primitive design. Chapter 7. The Production Miracle. To understand the true impact of the Higgins boat on World War II, we need to look at the numbers, because the numbers are staggering. When Andrew Higgins received that first large order in August 1941, his company employed about 500 people and was building perhaps 100 boats per year. By 1943, Higgins Industries employed more than 20,000 people working around the clock in 7 facilities across New Orleans. The company was producing boats at a rate that seemed impossible. At peak production, a new Higgins boat was rolling out of the factory every 16 minutes. This wasn't just about scaling up existing production. Higgins had to revolutionize boat building itself, applying mass production techniques that had never been used in the boat industry. He borrowed ideas from Henry Ford's automobile assembly lines, from aircraft manufacturing, from anywhere he could find efficiency improvements. The result was one of the great industrial achievements of the war. By the time Japan surrendered in 1945, Higgins Industries had produced 20,094 landing craft of various types, 1,453 PT boats, patrol torpedo boats, 357 other military craft. That's more than 21,000 vessels in just under 4 years. To put that in perspective, the entire German Navy at the start of the war comprised about 95 vessels of all types. But the Higgins boat's impact wasn't just about numbers. It was about what those numbers enabled. The LCVP, landing craft, vehicle, personnel, the most common Higgins boat, could carry 36 troops or a vehicle and 12 troops. It could make the run from transport ship to beach and back in under an hour under good conditions. This meant that a single LCVP could theoretically land hundreds of troops per day. Multiply that by thousands of boats, and you begin to understand how the Allies were able to conduct amphibious operations that dwarfed anything previously attempted in military history. At Normandy, the Allies landed 150,000 troops on the first day. At Okinawa, the opening assault involved 180,000 troops. These numbers were impossible without the Higgins boat. There was simply no other way to move that many men from ship to shore quickly enough to establish a beachhead before defenders could concentrate their forces. The production miracle also had another critical advantage: replacements. Landing craft were expendable weapons. They were expected to be damaged or destroyed in combat. The fact that Higgins could produce boats so quickly meant that losses could be rapidly replaced. After the costly invasion of Tarawa in November 1943, where more than 100 landing craft were destroyed or damaged, the Navy needed replacements immediately. Higgins Industries ramped up production and delivered the replacement craft within weeks. A pre-war Navy would have needed months or years to replace such losses. This production capability, this ability to build simple, effective weapons in overwhelming numbers, was one of America's greatest strategic advantages in the war. And it was perfectly embodied in the Higgins boat. But production was only half the story. The other half was who was building these boats, and that's where another revolution was taking place. Chapter 8. The Workforce Revolution. When Andrew Higgins started scaling up production in 1942, he faced a critical problem. Where would he find 20,000 workers in the middle of a war, when most young men were being drafted into the military? His solution was radical for the time. He would hire anyone who could do the work, regardless of race or gender. In 1942 New Orleans, this was revolutionary. The South was still deeply segregated, and most defense contractors either refused to hire African Americans or relegated them to the most menial positions. Women were rarely employed in manufacturing roles. Higgins didn't care about any of that. He needed workers, and he needed them fast. His hiring policy was simple. If you could do the job, you were hired, period. By 1943, Higgins Industries employed a workforce that was roughly 40% African American, an almost unheard of percentage for a Southern defense contractor. Women made up about 20% of the workforce, operating machinery, welding, doing electrical work, and supervising assembly lines. This wasn't because Higgins was particularly progressive or idealistic. He was a businessman trying to maximize production, and he recognized that talent had nothing to do with race or gender. In his own words, "I'm interested in ability. I don't care about the color of a man's skin or whether they're a man or woman. Can they do the work? That's all I want to know." This practical approach to integration made Higgins Industries a target for segregationists. He received threats, faced pressure from local political leaders, and dealt with attempts to sabotage his operations. He ignored all of it. When local officials complained about his integrated workforce, Higgins told them that anyone who didn't like his hiring practices could take it up with the Navy, and he implied that any attempt to interfere with his operations would be considered sabotage of the war effort. The workforce itself, despite the tensions of the era, generally functioned smoothly. Workers were too busy to worry about prejudices. They were building boats around the clock, under enormous pressure to meet production quotas. The shared mission of supporting the troops overseas created a sense of purpose that transcended social divisions. One African-American worker from Higgins Industries, interviewed in the 1990s, recalled, "We knew that the boats we were building were carrying Marines onto beaches in the Pacific. We knew that if we didn't do our jobs right, men would die. That kind of responsibility has a way of making everything else seem less important." The women working at Higgins Industries faced their own challenges. Many had never worked in manufacturing before, and they had to prove themselves capable in jobs that were traditionally considered men's work. But they did prove themselves, and many became supervisors and skilled workers. This workforce revolution at Higgins Industries was a small-scale preview of the larger social changes that would sweep through American society in the decades after the war. The experience of working together, of proving that race and gender were irrelevant to job performance, planted seeds that would eventually grow into the civil rights and women's liberation movements. But in 1942 and 1943, the workers at Higgins Industries weren't thinking about social revolution. They were thinking about production quotas, about quality control, about getting boats built and shipped out to the men who needed them. And those boats were about to face their ultimate test on the beaches of the world's bloodiest conflict. Chapter 9. Proving Ground. The Pacific War. The first major test of the Higgins boat in combat came at Guadalcanal in August 1942. The assault was the opening move of the American island hopping campaign across the Pacific, and it would set the pattern for dozens of amphibious operations to come. The landing force consisted of 19,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division. They would be delivered to the beaches by Higgins boats, with most troops having never even seen a Higgins boat before, let alone trained with one. The initial landings on Guadalcanal went surprisingly smoothly. Japanese defenders were concentrated inland, and resistance on the beaches was light. But this allowed military observers to witness the Higgins boat performing exactly as designed in combat conditions. The boats ran onto the beaches, dropped their ramps, and Marines charged out, directly onto sand. The boats then retracted and returned for more loads. Within hours, thousands of Marines were ashore, along with their equipment and supplies. The speed of the landings surprised even American commanders. But the real test came at Tarawa in November 1943. Tarawa was a nightmare. The tiny atoll of Baitio was transformed by Japanese engineers into perhaps the most heavily fortified position in the Pacific. Thousands of Japanese troops waited in concrete bunkers and fortified positions. The coral reef surrounding the island meant that landing craft would have to cross hundreds of yards of shallow water under direct fire. The assault on Tarawa was one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. Nearly 1,000 Marines died, and 2,000 were wounded in just 76 hours of fighting. But despite the horrific casualties, the battle proved the value of the Higgins boat. Many of the landing craft couldn't make it over the reef and had to discharge their troops into chest-deep water hundreds of yards from shore. Marines were cut down by Japanese fire as they struggled through the water. It was exactly the nightmare scenario that amphibious planners had feared. But the Higgins boats that did make it over the reef, and those that found channels through it, were able to deliver their troops directly onto the beach. These Marines had a much higher survival rate. They could disembark onto sand and immediately engage the enemy, rather than struggling through water while under fire. The lesson was clear. The Higgins boat was life-saving technology. When it could get close to shore, American casualties dropped dramatically. After Tarawa, American amphibious doctrine evolved. Better reconnaissance of landing beaches, improved naval bombardment, specialized vehicles, but at the center of it all was still the Higgins boat. At Saipan, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, in every major amphibious operation of the Pacific War, thousands of Higgins boats delivered Marines and soldiers onto hostile shores. Each landing was different, each presented unique challenges, but the basic pattern was the same. The boats drove onto the beaches, discharged their loads, and went back for more. One Marine veteran, interviewed years after the war, put it simply, "That boat saved my life and the lives of everyone I served with. We hit the beach running, not swimming. That made all the difference." By the end of the Pacific War, Higgins boats had participated in more than 50 major amphibious operations and countless smaller landings. They had carried hundreds of thousands of troops onto contested beaches from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. Without these boats, the island-hopping campaign that led to Japan's doorstep would have been impossible. The Japanese assessment of American amphibious capabilities had been catastrophically wrong, and their empire paid the price. Chapter 10: D-Day and the European Theater. While Higgins boats were proving themselves in the Pacific, the greatest test of amphibious warfare in history was being planned in England, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. The initial assault would involve landing 150,000 troops across 5 beaches on the Normandy coast. This would require the largest amphibious fleet ever assembled, thousands of ships and landing craft. At the heart of this massive operation were Higgins boats. The LCVP would carry the infantry assault troops, while the larger LCM would deliver tanks, artillery, and vehicles. Without these boats, D-Day simply couldn't happen. The challenges facing the invasion force were enormous. The Germans had spent years fortifying the Atlantic Wall. Beach obstacles, steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes topped with mines, concrete barriers, were designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. Artillery and machine guns were positioned to create killing zones on the beaches, and the weather refused to cooperate. The original invasion date had to be postponed due to storms. When General Eisenhower finally gave the go-ahead on June 6, 1944, conditions were still marginal: rough seas, strong winds, poor visibility. These were exactly the conditions that many planners had feared would make an amphibious assault impossible. But Higgins boats were designed for rough conditions. They had been tested in the Louisiana bayous, in the open waters of the Atlantic, in every condition imaginable. They were built for this. The assault began before dawn. Thousands of Higgins boats, loaded with troops who had been waiting in transport ships, began the run to shore. The seas were rough. Many soldiers were seasick. Boats shipped water. The ride was miserable. But the boats kept going. At Omaha Beach, where German defenses were strongest and the assault plan went badly wrong, Higgins boats drove straight into hell. German machine guns and artillery opened fire on the approaching craft. Some boats were hit and sank. Others made it to the beach obstacles only to be torn apart by mines. But others, hundreds of others, made it through. They hit the beach, dropped their ramps, and troops poured out into the maelstrom. Many of those troops were immediately cut down by German fire, but others found cover, began to fight back, began to push inland. Without the Higgins boat, Omaha Beach would have been impossible. The ability to deliver troops directly onto the sand, rather than forcing them to wade through hundreds of yards of surf zone, was the difference between a bloody victory and a catastrophic defeat. At the other landing beaches, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword, conditions were somewhat better, and Higgins boats delivered troops with devastating efficiency. By the end of the day, despite fierce German resistance and heavy casualties, the Allies had established a foothold in France. Over the following days and weeks, Higgins boats continued to deliver troops and supplies across the beaches. Even after ports were captured, the boats remained essential. They could land on any beach, didn't need port facilities, and could deliver cargo directly to wherever it was needed. The famous photographs of D-Day, troops wading through water from landing craft with front ramps down, are almost all of Higgins boats. That simple, elegant design had become the symbol of the Allied return to Europe. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, later said of Andrew Higgins, "He is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. Coming from Eisenhower, who commanded all Allied forces in Europe and coordinated the largest amphibious invasion in history, this was no casual compliment. It was recognition of a fundamental truth. Without the Higgins boat, the Allies could not have conducted the amphibious operations that won the war. Chapter 11. The Man Behind the Boat. Throughout this story, Andrew Higgins himself remains a fascinating character. He wasn't a typical defense contractor, wasn't a military man, wasn't a formally trained naval architect. He was a businessman, a self-taught engineer, a hard-driving boss who demanded perfection from his workers and gave them the tools to achieve it. He was profane, short-tempered, and absolutely convinced of his own rightness, which, as it turned out, was justified. Higgins ran his company with an iron fist. He was known to fire people on the spot for incompetence, but also to reward excellence generously. He paid well by the standards of the time, and he believed in promoting based on merit rather than credentials or connections. He had no patience for bureaucracy, for political considerations, or for anyone who tried to tell him his boats weren't good enough. When Navy officials criticized his designs, he didn't politely consider their objections. He proved them wrong through demonstration. This abrasive personality made him enemies in Washington and in military procurement offices. Even after his boats proved themselves in combat, there were officials who disliked Higgins personally and looked for opportunities to cut his contracts or favor other manufacturers. Higgins fought back by appealing directly to the Marines and soldiers who used his boats. He encouraged military personnel to write testimonials, collected feedback from the field, and used this information to continuously improve his designs and to defend against critics. He also wasn't above using public relations and the media to his advantage. When he felt the Navy was treating him unfairly, he would leak stories to newspapers, generating public pressure. His attitude was simple. The troops needed the best equipment, and his boats were the best, and anyone who got in the way of delivering those boats to the troops was part of the problem. This aggressive approach worked, but it also meant that Higgins never received many of the official honors and recognitions that other defense contractors received. He was too controversial, too combative, too willing to embarrass people in power. After the war ended, demand for landing craft collapsed almost overnight. Higgins Industries, which had employed more than 20,000 people at its peak, rapidly downsized. By 1946, the company was struggling. By 1948, it was on the verge of bankruptcy. Andrew Higgins fought to save his company, trying to convert to civilian boat production, looking for new military contracts. But the post-war economy was difficult for defense contractors, and Higgins lacked the political connections that helped other companies survive. In 1952, Higgins Industries ceased operations. Andrew Higgins died of a heart attack later that year, at the age of 67. He died relatively poor compared to the wartime peak of his company, having poured his own money into trying to save his business. It was an ignominious end for the man who, according to Eisenhower, had won the war for us. Chapter 12. The Legacy. The Higgins boat, officially designated the LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, didn't outlive its creator by much. By the 1950s, the thousands of Higgins boats built during the war were being scrapped or mothballed. The design was replaced by more sophisticated amphibious craft, by helicopters, by new technologies. But the impact of the Higgins boat on military history is permanent and profound. The boat revolutionized amphibious warfare. Before the Higgins boat, amphibious assaults were small-scale operations limited by the difficulty of getting troops ashore quickly. After the Higgins boat, amphibious assaults could be conducted on a massive scale, projecting military power across oceans. This capability fundamentally altered strategic calculations. Islands couldn't be made impregnable. If an enemy could land troops in overwhelming numbers, fortifications could be overcome. Coastal defense became vastly more difficult. The ability to choose when and where to land gave the attacker enormous advantages. The lessons learned from Higgins boat operations influenced all subsequent amphibious warfare doctrine. Modern landing craft, hovercraft, and helicopters all owe a debt to the concepts that Higgins proved. Get troops to shore quickly, minimize their vulnerability during the approach, enable rapid extraction and return for additional loads. Beyond military history, the Higgins boat represents something important about innovation and problem solving. Here was a problem that stumped credentialed experts for years: how to conduct effective amphibious assaults. The solution came not from naval architects with advanced degrees, but from a boat builder who had learned his craft in the Louisiana bayous, evading Coast Guard cutters during Prohibition. Higgins succeeded because he focused on solving the actual problem, rather than on creating something that looked sophisticated. His boats were simple because simplicity was superior. They were cheap because expensive complexity added nothing. They were effective because every design element had been tested under real conditions. This is a lesson that applies far beyond boat design. Sometimes the best solution to a complex problem is an elegant simplification. Sometimes practical experience beats theoretical knowledge. Sometimes the outsider with unconventional experience sees what the credentialed experts cannot. The Higgins boat also represents a uniquely American approach to war production, the mobilization of civilian industry, and the application of mass production techniques to military equipment. This wasn't beautiful technology. Nobody would put a Higgins boat in a museum as an example of aesthetic engineering, but it was profoundly effective, and it could be produced in overwhelming numbers. This approach, simple, effective, mass-produced weapons that could overwhelm enemies through sheer numbers, would characterize much of American military production throughout the 20th century. Chapter 13. What if? It's worth considering a counterfactual. What if the Navy had never adopted the Higgins boat? What if bureaucratic resistance had prevented Higgins from getting his contracts, and the United States had gone to war with the inferior landing craft that the Navy's Bureau of Ships was developing? The Pacific War would have been dramatically different. The island-hopping campaign that brought American forces to Japan's doorstep depended entirely on the ability to conduct large-scale amphibious assaults. With inferior landing craft, these operations would have been slower, bloodier, and potentially impossible. Japan might have been able to hold their island strongpoints indefinitely, forcing the United States into a costly war of attrition. The timeline for defeating Japan would have stretched out significantly, perhaps by years. In Europe, without adequate landing craft, the invasion of North Africa would have been more difficult. The invasion of Sicily might have failed, and D-Day, well, D-Day as it actually happened, would have been impossible. The Allies might have been forced to rely on a different strategy, perhaps a delayed invasion, perhaps approaching Europe through different routes, perhaps accepting a longer war of attrition. All of these alternatives would have resulted in more casualties, a longer war, and an uncertain outcome. It's possible that without the Higgins boat, Germany might have completed its atomic bomb program before the Allies could invade Europe. It's possible that war weariness might have led to a negotiated peace rather than unconditional surrender. It's possible that the entire post-war world order would be different. This might sound like hyperbole, but it's not. Major military historians have concluded that amphibious capability was essential to Allied victory. Admiral John Lehman wrote that, without the Higgins boats, the United States likely would not have won World War II. That's not an exaggeration. It's a sober assessment of how dependent Allied strategy was on this single piece of technology. One man, designing boats in New Orleans, working with practical knowledge learned from building boats for smugglers, created a weapon that quite literally changed the course of history. And yet, how many people have heard of Andrew Higgins? How many people know that the boat that won the war was designed by a former bootlegger fighting against Navy bureaucracy? Epilogue. The boat that won the war. On the National D-Day Memorial in Bedford, Virginia, there stands a bronze sculpture of a Higgins boat, its front ramped down, frozen in the moment of delivering troops into battle. It's a fitting memorial to both the men who rode in those boats and the man who designed them. In New Orleans, there's a museum dedicated to the history of Higgins Industries and its role in World War II. Visitors can see the workshops where the boats were built, can examine the tools and techniques used, can learn about the integrated workforce that made the production miracle possible. But these memorials, while important, can't capture the full magnitude of what the Higgins boat represented. This was a weapon designed by a civilian, refined through years of practical experience, rejected by military bureaucracy, finally adopted only when war made the need undeniable. It was simple when experts wanted complexity, cheap when procurement officers expected expensive, effective when traditionalists dismissed it. It carried more than 1 million troops into combat. It delivered victory to beaches from the Pacific to the Mediterranean to Normandy. It enabled a strategic flexibility that adversaries couldn't match and couldn't counter. The Japanese called it a dumb boat. German intelligence labeled it primitive. Navy bureaucrats dismissed it as too simple. They were all wrong. Andrew Higgins designed a boat based on practical experience and clear-eyed problem-solving. He refused to make it more complex than it needed to be. He insisted that simplicity was strength, not weakness, and he fought for 8 years to get military officials to understand this. When they finally did, when they finally saw his boats in action and realized what they had, the course of the war changed. That dumb boat conquered 2 oceans and 3 continents. It delivered the fighting power of democracy to the shores of tyranny. It turned coastal fortifications into speed bumps rather than strongholds. It made the impossible routine and the theoretical practical. General Eisenhower was right. Andrew Higgins won the war for us. But the real lesson of the Higgins boat isn't about World War II specifically. It's about innovation, about problem solving, about having the courage to fight for a better solution, even when institutional forces resist change. It's about recognizing that sometimes the best solution comes from unexpected places, from a boat builder in Louisiana rather than from naval architects in Washington, from practical experience rather than theoretical study, from simple elegance rather than complex sophistication. It's about understanding that in war, as in any endeavor, what matters is what works, not what looks impressive, not what makes bureaucrats comfortable, not what fits established procedures, but what actually solves the problem you're facing. Andrew Higgins understood this. He built a boat that worked, and in doing so, he changed history. The next time you hear about a simple solution being dismissed as too basic or not sophisticated enough, think about the Higgins boat. Think about how Japanese and German intelligence analysts looked at photographs of a simple plywood boat and saw weakness when they should have seen genius. Think about how the boat that won the war started as the boat that was rejected for 8 years by the people who needed it most. And remember that sometimes, often simple is better. Sometimes the outsider is right and the experts are wrong. Sometimes the most important innovations look obvious only in hindsight. The Higgins boat was all of these things. It was simple, elegant, and devastating. It was the creation of an outsider who understood the problem better than the experts. And it looks obvious now. Of course you need a boat that can beach itself, discharge troops, and retract quickly. Of course that's how amphibious warfare should work. But it wasn't obvious in 1933, or 1938, or even 1941. It took one man's vision, persistence, and willingness to fight against institutional resistance to make it real. That dumb boat won the war, and the man who built it, the former bootlegger who fought the Navy for 8 years to get his design accepted, deserves to be remembered as one of the great innovators of the 20th century. Andrew Jackson Higgins, the boat builder who won World War II.